Brahms's E minor cello sonata opens with a deep and brooding exposition which embodies the ideas of the Romantic period of Western classical music. The melody carried in the cello continues to wax and wane, but never strays too far away from the powerful and imposing sound of the lower registers of the cello. Emotion continues to build in both instruments, before unleashing a forceful explosion that carries a motif that is repeated throughout the movement. These settle back down into the development section of the sonata, which, as the name suggests, continues to develop the musical ideas that were explored in the exposition, before eventually returning back to the dominant motif in the piano, as the cello is now reduced to accompaniment. This sonata is one of my favourites, both to listen to and to play. In this recording, legendary cellist Jacqueline Dupre plays with her husband Daniel Barenboim and does what she does best, infusing great power and depth of sound with touching emotion and delicacy in her phrasing and tone. But outside the technical and musical side, this sonata also displays the emphasis that emotion and individualism played in the Romantic movements in many forms of art, whether it be painting, music, or writing that predominated much of the 19th century. Some of the most famous pieces of classical music stem from this period, whether it be the triumphant, soaring moments of the best of Tchaikovsky or the virtuosity and elegance of Chopin. Romanticism is an aesthetic that highlights the importance of emotion in the self, often invoking images of a stoic figure posing alone in a misty forest, dressed in a long coat and cane in hand. This can, however, lead to the idolization of isolation and a brooding nature, which can eventually lead to an idolization of melancholia and depression. It creates sadness as an aesthetic to be chased after, something to be admired and desired rather than overcome. The reality is that depression is a mental illness that has severe ramifications on a person's life, not a superpower that will inspire you with great creativity. There are a wealth of videos analysing the trends of social media such as TikTok, Instagram, and Tumblr that seem to embrace and chase the unhealthy ideal of being sad. Many people want to be the misunderstood artist that takes their suffering and uses it to elevate their work to a transcendental level. This is what I see as a misguided interpretation of Romanticism, taking the intense emotion and expression of individualism and turning it into a competition to see who is more traumatized, who is more damaged. There's no value in being happy, since if you're happy, you aren't able to create meaningful pieces of art. You aren't able to be profound and infuse your sadness into everything you do. There is a fetishization of sadness, and it is exalted as the true state of being. Now, I'm a fan of Taylor Swift. Having an older sister, her early music shaped my childhood, and her rise to become the biggest pop star in the world made her later music almost unavoidable. That being said, I was not a fan of Midnight's. To me, it was an attempt to capitalize off the quote-unquote sad girl style that had jumped into the mainstream with the advent of artists like Lana Del Rey and Phoebe Bridgers. This can be most seen in this Instagram post that announced the album. It has been ridiculed as being too dramatic and serious for a Taylor Swift album, but I think it is representative of the direction that she is trying to shift into. The mold of the suffering artist sitting drunk and alone in a room with head in her hands. A tortured soul that pours out all her emotion into her music. This is the hyper-romanticization of the artist that tricks people into thinking that they must access their melancholia to create great works of art. A quick search for melancholy on TikTok will yield a ton of compilations of movie clips or random photos of sad-looking people in an attempt to make sadness look beautiful. In fact, many believe that they are of a melancholic temperament, which supposedly predisposes them to being silent sufferers that hide their powerful emotions and remain steadfast in the face of adversity. Depression and feeling of worthlessness are glamorized and elevated as valuable qualities of themselves. They have a desire to feel sad, to be that tortured soul that they see in the media they consume. But sadness and even depression is almost a universal experience, and great art is often derived from these feelings. Many artists struggle with mental health issues, and even links between things like bipolar depression and creativity have been drawn. But this does not necessarily mean that their sadness was the driving force behind their creativity. A personal favourite director of mine embodies this sentiment in much of their work. If Brahms's cello sonata represents the romantic ideals of the artist, Chantal Akerman embodies the exact opposite. Through her works, we see vivid yet reserved representations of her life and emotions. Her 1978 film Les Rendezvous d'Anna is an almost autobiographical account of a young director's experience while on tour for her latest film. When we consider the way that themes of isolation and sadness are depicted here, we see the reality of the depressed artist. Throughout Anna's pilgrimage through Europe, she meets strangers, friends, and family who all pour their hearts out in conversation with her. Each encounter feels more like someone monologuing at Anna rather than proper dialogue, as Anna disengages from many of these interactions and quietly nods or mutters small, uninterested replies. The reality is that the depressed artist is not romantically melancholic in a candlelit room composing a masterwork. They are a lifeless husk who gets through life on the bare minimum. When Anna is alone, she spends most of her time in a hotel room staring at blank walls and listening to the radio. She tries to busy herself with a menial task of returning a tie, but it doesn't take up nearly as much time as she needs it to. She anxiously awaits a call and moves around the room in an unsettled manner. Akerman makes sure that we linger for uncomfortable periods of time in her isolation, forcing us to consider what bubbles beneath the surface. Anna is a listless drifter who people desperately want to connect to, but she doesn't let them in. The only person that she can open herself up to is her mother. It's then important to note that Akerman herself was very close to her mother, and the mother-daughter relationship plays a large role in many of her films, particularly those which directly involve her own mother, such as News from Home or No Home Movie. There is no beauty in sadness here. There is only desolation and crushing loneliness. Akerman herself battled with depression, ultimately committing suicide in 2015. She understood that the reality of being a depressed artist, a tortured soul, is not a romantic existence, rather a miserable and disappointing life. Without a way to express herself in a meaningful and satisfying way, Anna stands still as the world passes by her. The romantic ideal of the artist is torn asunder, and we are left with a defeated and hopeless person who is devoid of emotion, let alone boundless creativity. The final sequence is a microcosm of the entire film and its themes, with Anna lying on top of her bed and listening to the messages she received while away on tour. Each one is someone trying to reach out to her, asking her, begging her to call them back. She doesn't react to any of these in a noticeable way and cycles through them, staring at the ceiling. We can imagine that she won't call any of these people back, and we see the frustration mount in the penultimate message. Anna is shut off from the rest of the world, something that will lead to her downfall if left unaddressed. There is an undeniable attraction to being tragically beautiful. Mac Miller's death and the release of Circles, Amy Winehouse and her disastrous final tour, Hubo and his film An Elephant Standing Still in the wake of his death. These people were all celebrated artists whose lives were cut short in a tragic manner. We crave the praise and attention that these figures garnered in the wake of their deaths. We idolize their struggles, their mental illness, their substance abuse, and their self-destructive mannerisms. We share photos of them in black and white as they stare mysteriously into the camera, as if to suggest that they had the secret to life in their back pocket, had only they lived a little longer. We look at these people with reverence, because those who are dead cannot rewrite their stories. Their lives are available for us to thrust our deepest fears and desires onto. It's then important to ask ourselves why someone might desire to be a misunderstood genius, someone who is shunned by society only to be recognized post-mortem. We romanticize this vision of the artist as a way of being right, of proving people wrong and rising above our demons to become a legend in our field. Single people are elevated as generational talents, as gods that walk among us. The deification of artists in general leads us to crave this recognition from others, one that tells us that we are better than the average person. We are special. So we look to the greats of our past and see that they were lone wolves, melancholic in disposition due to their revolutionary ideas that lurked in the transom of their minds. We emulate their struggles only to realize, like Anna, that depression is not something to be desired. The tragedy in someone who seeks to be sad is not in their self-destructive actions or a life cursed with misfortune, but rather in the misinterpretation of sadness itself as the source of greatness, rather than the motivator to become great. Depression will not elevate your art to the next level. It can inform the themes and profoundly influence your outlook on the world, but only after it has been overcome. Akerman teaches us that the depressed artist is an unproductive one, someone who shuns their responsibilities, yet does not create anything, let alone their magnum opus. We aren't invited to glorify Anna's existence, rather we are told to fear it, to stave it off with whatever we can. We are told that the truth of the suffering artist is a truth that we never want to face.